last night I had every light in the house on. I was hoping that I would just get just ran over by the kids running in the door and just like barrel rushing me, but it didn't happen. And it was just a traumatic night trying to be here. I mean, yeah, my kids are my life. I mean, those smiles light up my life. And it's like, I mean, last night, like during like when they usually eat dinner, it was just like I miss them. Like
A quiet neighborhood. A loving mother. Two beautiful little girls. A husband who seemed devoted. The perfect family, until, one morning, they were gone. A desperate search. A husband pleading for their safe return. A community rallying in support. But within days, the truth came to light, and it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Chris Watts confessed. He stood before the world, admitting to unspeakable acts. A man who murdered his pregnant wife. A father who ended the lives of his own children. The nation was left in shock. The case was closed, or so we thought. 7 years have passed. A prison cell now holds the man who once smiled for family photos, tucked his daughters into bed, and kissed his wife goodnight. But he hasn't been silent. Through letters, through whispered confessions to fellow inmates, a new story is emerging. A new version of events. One that shifts blame, rewrites history, and raises terrifying questions. What is the truth? What is the lie? And most importantly, what has Chris Watts finally revealed? Before we dive into this chilling story, I want to hear from you. Do you believe Chris Watts is truly remorseful, or is he still trying to avoid responsibility for the horrific crimes he committed? What do you think of his latest confessions and letters from prison? This case has haunted the world for years, but now, new letters and confessions from Chris Watts are stirring up even more questions. Stick with us as we unravel the truth behind these chilling revelations. Subscribe now to stay up to date on this case and more true crime stories. You won't want to miss what comes next. Frederick, Colorado. A town of just over 13,000 people, where neighbors know each other by name, and crime is something that happens somewhere else. A place where families build their lives, where children ride bikes down tree-lined streets, and where nothing, absolutely nothing, ever seems out of place. Shanann Watts was a woman who embraced life. A dedicated mother, a thriving businesswoman, and by all appearances, deeply in love with her husband, Chris Watts. On social media, she shared moments of joy, celebrating milestones, expressing gratitude for the man she believed was her perfect partner. But online images only tell part of the story. Chris Watts. A husband. A father. The man Shanann called her rock. To those around them, he was quiet, reserved, the kind of person who avoided confrontation. To friends and family, he was a devoted dad, carrying his daughters on his shoulders, kissing Shanann in their social media videos, playing the role of the loving husband. But on the morning of August 13, 2018, everything changed. It started with silence. Shanann Watts, 20 weeks pregnant with her third child, missed an important doctor's appointment. She didn't return calls. She didn't respond to messages. To her close friend and colleague, this was unthinkable. Shanann was always connected. Always responsive. Something was wrong. Concern grew into alarm. A wellness check was requested. The police arrived at the Watts home. Chris answered the door, his expression tense, his answers short. He invited them in. The house was immaculate, too perfect. But there was something missing. Shanann. Bella. Celeste. Nowhere to be found. Shanann's phone. Her purse. The girl's favorite blankets. All still there. Yet the mother and daughters had vanished without a trace. Chris Watts stood in front of the cameras, his voice steady, his eyes dry. He begged for his wife and daughters to come home. He said he was worried. He said he had no idea where they could be. He said he just wanted his family back. But behind that plea, there was something else. Something unsettling. Something off. The nation watched. Investigators listened. And in the hours that followed, the walls of Chris Watts' perfect life began to close in around him. Chris Watts told the officers during the search of his home that he had an emotional conversation with Shanann that morning about separating. He says she planned to take the kids to a friend's house. But there's one problem, no one has seen them leave. A neighbor's security footage captures Chris early that morning, moving back and forth between his garage and his truck. He later tells police he was loading tools for work. Investigators aren't convinced. The following day, Chris Watts makes a public appeal. He stands on his porch, arms folded, and looks into the camera. Chris Watts, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, please bring her back. This house isn't the same without you. Viewers immediately noticed something was off. There were no tears. No sense of urgency. His words said one thing, but his body language said another. Neighbor, to police, he's not acting right at all. He never talks this much. He's fidgety. Something's off. Investigators begin to suspect that Chris Watts knows more than he's admitting. Then, a discovery changes everything. Investigators pull Chris Watts' phone records and find late-night calls to a woman named Nichol Kessinger, a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum. A woman he had been seeing for weeks. Texts between them reveal a romantic relationship. Chris had told Nichol that he was in the final stages of a divorce. That his marriage was over. But that wasn't true. According to Nichol Kessinger, he told me he was leaving his wife. I thought he was going through a separation. If I had known what was really going on, I never would have been involved with him. She tells investigators that Chris seemed normal until the day his family vanished. Then, he started acting strangely, deleting messages, avoiding calls, and suddenly saying he didn't want to see her. The most chilling discovery. Just days before the murders, Chris had been searching for wedding venues and looking up ways to start a new life, without his wife and kids. The polygraph and confession. With mounting evidence, investigators bring Chris in for questioning. He agrees to take a polygraph test. Examiner, Chris, do you know where Shanann, Bella, and Celeste are? Chris Watts fails. Miserably. The results show deception. When detectives confront him, his story begins to break. With nowhere left to turn, Chris finally confesses. But what he says shocks even the investigators. Chris Watts, I walked in, and Shanann was on top of the girls. She killed them. I lost it. Detective, Chris, there is absolutely no way Shanann did that. Investigators don't believe him. There is no evidence that Shanann harmed her daughters. But at this moment, Chris Watts refuses to tell the full truth. 3 days after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, investigators uncovered a grim truth. Chris Watts had been lying. His family hadn't vanished, he had taken them to a secluded oil site owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. August 16, 2018. Cadaver dogs led investigators to a shallow grave. Inside, they found the body of Shanann Watts, 15 weeks pregnant, wrapped in a sheet. Nearby, workers noticed something strange about the oil tanks. The hatches had been tampered with. When investigators opened them, they found what no one wanted to believe. Bella and Celeste had been placed inside the oil tanks. Their bodies submerged in crude oil for days. A horrifying attempt to hide the evidence. Frank Razusek, they were taken from us. My daughter. My grandbabies. I'll never understand how anyone could do this. The town of Frederick was in shock. A man who had appeared to be a loving husband and father had committed the unthinkable. And now, there was no denying his guilt. On August 21, 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of his daughters, 1 for his wife, and 1 for Shanann's unborn son, Nichol. He also faced charges for tampering with a body and unlawful termination of a pregnancy. Initially, Watts denied everything. Then, in a desperate move to save himself, he took a plea deal, admitting to all charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. On the day of sentencing, the Watts and Rzusek families sat just feet apart, facing the man who had shattered their lives. Sandra Rzusek, I trusted you. I trusted you to take care of them. And instead, you took them from us. I will never forgive you for this. Chris Watts remained silent. No apology. No emotion. Just an empty stare. The judge, while pronouncing his sentence, stated, "This is the most inhumane and vicious crime I have ever handled. You may never see the light of day as a free man again." Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for tampering with the bodies and the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. A punishment ensuring he would never leave prison. Justice had been served. But for those who loved Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico, no sentence could undo the pain of their loss. Chris Watts' life in prison. Following his sentencing, Chris Watts was transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, a facility known for housing high-profile inmates. This move was made for his safety, given the notoriety of his crimes. Inside these walls, Watts leads a monotonous existence. Reports indicate he spends much of his time in protective custody, isolated from the general prison population due to threats against him. Interactions with fellow inmates are limited, but some accounts suggest he has found solace in religion, attending Bible study sessions and seeking forgiveness through faith. New confessions and letters. In a series of letters written from prison, Chris Watts began to open up about his crimes, offering new confessions that shed light on his thoughts and motives. In his first letter, written in December of 2018, Watts refers to Shanann as a control freak who allegedly pushed him into a corner emotionally and financially. He claims that her behavior pushed him over the edge and led him to the affair with Nichol Kessinger, though he doesn't fully acknowledge his own responsibility for the crimes. He further writes that Shanann's success with her business and her focus on her social media accounts left him feeling invisible and trapped. Despite these claims, Watts admits that he was a coward for his actions, but continues to blame the breakdown of his marriage for what happened. Letter dated, January 2019. In a subsequent letter dated January 2019, Watts refers to Nichol Kessinger as a Jezebel, stating that she seduced him and led him down a dangerous path. He says he wanted to escape the pressure of his life and that his relationship with Nichol Kessinger made him feel alive again. In this letter, Watts seems to downplay his responsibility and instead projects all blame onto Nichol Kessinger, casting her as the villain in his narrative. Letter dated, March 2019. In a letter from March 2019, Watts confesses a more detailed account of his actions the night he killed Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. He writes that he had been having an emotional breakdown and that after an argument with Shanann, he snapped. In this letter, Watts explains that the murders were not premeditated but fueled by a rush of anger and frustration. Although he confesses to murdering his wife and children, Watts still avoids taking full responsibility for his actions. His words reveal a pattern of self-pity and blame-shifting, with little recognition of the true horror he inflicted on his family. Psychologists who have reviewed these letters suggest that Watts' shifting blame is an attempt to avoid confronting the full weight of his actions. By projecting guilt onto others, he maintains a sense of victimhood. Letters from fellow inmates. In addition to his own letters, Watts' relationship with fellow inmates has also been documented. In 2019, Watts wrote letters to fellow inmate Dylan Tallman, who shared excerpts with the media. Letter from Dylan Tallman, July 2019. Tallman describes Watts as being emotionally detached from the gravity of his crimes. In one letter, Tolman writes that Watts showed little remorse and seemed more interested in finding a way to cope with the stress of his life in prison rather than confronting the reality of his victim's suffering. The correspondence paints a picture of Watts as someone who, even after his convictions, struggles with the weight of his actions. He is often described as expressing regret for getting caught rather than for the pain he caused his family. Impact on families. During one of the interview with Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, Shanann father Frank Rzusek stated, "Every time he speaks or writes, it's like he's killing them all over again. We just want him to stop." The Rzusek family continues to grapple with their immense loss, finding solace in community support and memorials honoring Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. In their quest to preserve the memories of their loved ones, they've established foundations and scholarships, ensuring that Shanann and her daughters are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. As the years pass, the pain remains, but so does the enduring legacy of a mother and her children whose lives were tragically cut short. As the final chapter of this tragic story unfolds, we are left with more questions than answers. Chris Watts' recent confessions have only deepened the mystery surrounding his true motives. But do they truly change how we view his actions? Or do they serve as another attempt at shifting blame? What are your thoughts on the credibility of his recent letters? Do they offer a glimpse into his remorse, or is it just another attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for the destruction he caused? We want to hear from you. Your voice matters, and together we can keep this conversation going. What do you think of the way Chris Watts is continuing to manipulate the narrative, even from behind bars? If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories, in-depth analysis, and new revelations in high-profile cases. This is just the beginning, and we promise you won't want to miss what's coming next.